In this video, we're going to go behind the scenes on the visual effects breakdown for Zack Snyder's The Army of the Dead. This is part 5 in the 5-part series. We're exploring adding Tig Notaro to Army of the Dead. Throughout this video, we're going to go deep into deconstructing the visual effects process of the film from the unique perspective of a visual effects supervisor. We'll discuss the work involved, the techniques, the technology, the process, all the key sequences of the film, and how all of them were created. I'm Allan McKay. I'm a visual effects supervisor in Hollywood. I've been working in the industry for over 25 years for studios like Industrial Light and Magic and dozens of other leading visual effects studios. On projects like Game of Thrones, Transformers, Star Trek, Superman Returns, Avengers Endgame, and many others. My goal is to teach artists and creators the skills and the knowledge to build a successful career in the creative industry, as well as the business side of being an artist. This is a 5-part video series. Each day this week, I'll be reviewing a new sequence of the film, as well as a compilation of all the visual effects at the end of the week. The goal is simply to break down and explain the shots and the challenges for each of these sequences, and share my thoughts as a visual effects supervisor on how I would approach a lot of these shots. Typically, we're handed a script. We've got to break down exactly what we need to do and allocate the right studios and the right people to each of these sequences. So this is an opportunity to be able to break down my thoughts on how I would approach a lot of these sequences and also discuss a lot of what's involved in that creative process. By the way, if you're enjoying the series, all the content that I have on this channel I make for free. All I ask in return is if you could please subscribe to this channel and like this video. It won't mean much to you, but it'll mean the world to me. And you won't miss out on any of the upcoming material that I'll be putting out daily. Finally, if there's a particular movie that you want to see covered in the upcoming visual effects breakdowns, let me know. Leave a comment below, as well as any questions that you might have about anything that wasn't covered or discussed here. I'm happy to answer all of that as well. So, let's get started. Okay, so let's dig into the Tignataro sequence. This will be the final big sequence in the film. I'm actually going to do some other one-off shots as well, so that way I'll mix it up a little bit. The Tig stuff is an interesting concept, and I haven't researched heavily into how they've done it. I'm going to talk about how I would go about doing this, but at the same time, I feel like it's something that isn't that interesting, even though it's gotten definitely a lot of press and attention. So I'm going to cover this, and then I'm going to circle back and do a couple of other shots that I didn't actually get to do in the time that we had in the other previous parts. So let's dive in. So the whole premise is they had a actor in the show, Chris D'Elia, who for one reason or another is no longer in the film. And because of that, they decided to replace the actor entirely, which I kind of understand, knowing that Netflix has gotten some pushback on some of their recent films. They probably don't want more negative press with the choices for content they're bringing in. So what they did is they added in a actor after the fact. They went and shot separate scenes for the entire movie for one of the main actors in the movie and digitally added her into the movie. And I think she did a great job. I'm not a big fan of Chris D'Elia at all. So I think that she did an awesome job. Definitely kind of makes for a more interesting character. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process and what's involved. I mean, I'm just going to play through this really quickly. But there's a shot in the film, a couple more. The main thing is that, as you can see, you're grouped in with a lot of people. It isn't... This is just some of the making of stuff, but it isn't like these are clean shots where you're just adding someone in the background or something. Like, you're interacting in moving camera shots. And I think that was the whole point of this movie, was to have very organic handheld camera shots for a lot of it, doing some really interesting stuff. And the problem is that now you're going and having to undo all of that and add someone in with moving cameras and things like that, like in this shot here. So it's pretty interesting realizing that you're pretty much having to do this for the entire film. So I'm just going to scrub through some of these, but you can see here, all of this is shot separately, and then she's digitally added in and tracked into the shots. It's kind of nuts. So like I said, discussing this stuff wouldn't be too fun, but I'm just going to walk through how typically I would probably approach this stuff, and I assume how they probably did as well. Now, there's a bunch of stuff like this. Like, I already knew this was something that had happened when I first saw the film, so this scene in particular, right away, I was just like, okay, like, clearly they just went and reshot this, because a majority of her time is actually up here, and she's only interacting with one of the other actors in the film. So it kind of makes sense. Like, you could get away with a lot just reshooting a majority of the stuff here, and then you got her flying the helicopter at the end of the movie, which, you know, most of those are close-ups anyway. It's not too big a deal. So the big boatload of shots is her interacting with everyone else, and those are going to be the tricky ones. So I'm pretty sure that these were all shot in one locked-off location, and you could get away with the majority of the work being done here without needing to digitally add anyone in. Now, also a cool little smoke ring. And that's one thing too, is that these days a majority of actors aren't smoking, because if you haven't heard, smoking's bad for your health. And so these days you're usually adding digital smoke into a lot of shots. I'm actually, I think, going to talk about that in a little bit too. But you got stuff like this. I'm just going to pick a shot. Let's just jump to a shot like this one here, for instance. Okay, so I'm just going to break down how I would be doing this. Step 1 is pick a better color. Okay, step 1 is, as a visual effects supervisor, I'd be going through with a coordinator, like on our end, and identifying every single shot that has her in it that needs to be replaced, or has him in it that needs to be replaced with Tig. So first of all, you're building out a shot sheet or shot list with every single shot that has Chris D'Elia in it that needs to be replaced. Once you've identified these, so shot list, the next thing would be to break it down into categories. In other words, there might be some where it's just like, okay, that's just going to be roto, you know, something like that. It's a lock-off camera. That won't be a big deal. So those ones are going to be category A for easy. And then you're going to have like category B, category C. So some of these might be like, okay, these need to be a motion control camera. These other ones here, maybe if we go and do a 3D scan of her, we can put her in as a digital double. Breaking it down to categories allows you to start to approach the problems in bulk rather than needing to go through individually and be like, what do we do here? So instead it's like, these are ones that we need to do digitally. Go scan her and then send it off to one of the studios and they're going to handle that stuff. Whereas these other ones, we're going to need to break them into shoots. And so these ones we're going to do on this day, they're all very similar cases. So we can shoot them in sequence. These ones are a bit more special. We're going to approach them differently. So you're breaking things down into different categories, so that way it's easy to start to approach things intelligently based on how similar they are. So building a shot list to identify which shots need to actually be done would be the first step. And the next step would be, like I said, to categorize all the different shot types, okay? Then at that point, it's going to be time for reshoots. And like I said, there's going to be go and do it in 3D. So a digi double and go and add them in there. There's still going to need to be work done to them, but that would be something that you can start to look at how you can resolve that without the reshoots happening. So the main thing is going to be to go back to your shot list and identify all the shots. First of all, you're going to have to remove the actor. So you're going to need to do a clean plate. And what that usually means is that you're going through and you're tracking the camera. You can pull the previously tracked shots if they were digital already. And from there, you can either pull from clean plates that you have that you shot on location, or from reference you have where, let's say this person moves over here, suddenly for a set amount of frames, you have a clean pass over here. So you can reference all of these and Frankenstein them together to eventually get a plate that doesn't have anyone in it. And that's the first step, is to make sure that you've removed the previous talent from the shot, so that way it's clean, which is what we call a clean plate, that you can then add the new talent into. So for a lot of these, let's just say that you're doing the reshoot, so you've brought them in, you've figured out the cameras and everything you want to do. The way that I would do a lot of this, typically on the day of reshoots, let's say, what you usually do is you'll have a stand-in, because usually the talent isn't going to be sitting there, let's say with the DP, with the lighting and everything else. They're not going to stand there and wait for you to get the lighting correct and get everything set up. What they'll usually do is they'll hire someone who looks similar to you, has similar skin tones as you, and their job is literally just to be a lighting stand-in. And they'll sit there and they'll just wait for the DP to set up all the lights and make sure everything looks great to get that perfect shot. And then they go away, the talent comes in, sits down, and they do their thing. And the rest of the time they're just sitting in the trailer, chilling out. And there's been times like, a good example would be Matrix. Buddy of mine had very similar skin to Morpheus, Lawrence Fishburne. So he was hired off the street just to come in and sit there and be Lawrence Fishburne's lighting stand-in, just because he had like the same kind of, how would you describe it, just very textured skin. If you notice, like Lawrence Fishburne's got like very bumpy skin all over. So whatever it's going to be, that way you're going to get the perfect lighting. It's going to look really epic. You know, if with the DP, that's going to be their forte, is to get the perfect shot, the perfect lighting, perfect feel to it. So these are the sorts of things you got to consider. When it comes to something like this, I imagine you would have a stand-in who you would figure out the pacing with. Okay, so you know, this person walks along with this timing, and this matches correctly with where Tig needs to stand to match 100% accurately to where Chris was previously standing. So me personally, I would have like a laser pointer or something that's just tracking on the ground, so that way if this was the ground, you got this dot just moving on the ground to kind of give you some point of reference. And that's kind of what they're doing here. They've got this talent walking, or talent stand-in person, human being, walking with them at the correct height. And I imagine that it's mostly for eyeline, because she's having a conversation with this guy, so it's going to be the same eyeline as what's he over here, Batista. So that's partially what it is to have someone that they can play off of, but at the same time, it's also for eyeline, but it's also for pacing, because if they have someone there, it's going to organically make them kind of walk at a similar pace. So I'd imagine that they were given pretty thorough instructions, just as much as her, just to make sure that like they're walking with the right timing, and that way she can step in and play off of that. But that's typically what I would do, is I would really be meticulous about getting the pacing right, so that way everyone knows where to stand, but also where to move, so that way you're aligning 100% with everything going on. It's tricky because all of these are, I think there's like a handheld camera in the shot, so that makes things a lot more difficult overall, because even then you're going to need to stabilize her somewhat. So I kind of wonder whether some of this stuff might be shot overscan, meaning that if that is the frame, you might actually film with a slightly wider lens, purely so that way you've got a little bit more play in the plate. So that way if you need to stabilize her and rotate her around, or do anything like that, then you can do that, and there's still going to be some leftover footage in here, so that way it's not clipped. You know, so this is what I mean by categories, because each shot is going to have its own challenges, but in addition to that, there's going to be a lot of similar challenges, which is why they fall into those categories. So there's actually, like, I'm up in Portland, Oregon right now, and it's a Precision. They've got this camera gimbal, which is motion controlled here, which is pretty cool. I was going to buy one because I was looking at the prices and it said 40,000. I'm like, I'm buying one, and then I realized it was, to rent was 40,000 a day. But these are essentially a camera arm that you can feed motion control information to. And that's why I feel like a lot of these, not this particular shot because this is a handheld, but for some, I feel like you could actually do a 3D camera track and get it fairly accurate, feed that in through like Maya, accepts like different file formats, but Maya, for instance, give it an MA file, and what will happen is that this will imitate that exact camera motion, and it's got a fair amount of range to it. These things are quite giant, and so this arm can move and mimic what's actually happening in frame. So that way it can imitate exactly what the camera's doing, and you can have this person walking along, and the camera's capturing the motion pretty accurately to what was originally filmed. I feel like there would be a handful of those where it would make sense. And knowing that like she's not necessarily moving very far away in any of these shots, you could do this quite often. It's not like you see her running through any shots where you're tracking a large amount of distance. So this sort of thing can make sense a lot of the time. I feel like that's another category. And then you got shots like this, which this is all shot on a dolly, and it's just panning or kind of dollying and panning around them. And so it's more about trying to match accurately what they did there. And so in that case, it's more about just trying to get the exact setup that you had and do a few dry runs and try to get things as accurate in the move as possible. I'd imagine they're doing some real-time previs just to say, okay, if this person's standing here, how's that match in the shot? Hopefully that's an option. It's hard to say. But that's ultimately like a shot like this is tricky because the camera is arcing right around them as it swoops around. But the thing is, it is on a track, so it's predictable movement to an extent. So it's more about let's just do this a bunch of times and try to get as close as possible and then stabilize it where needed. In this shot here, obviously, like I said, this is a handheld shot. You've got the bounce card behind her, so that way she's backlit. And that's really important, just so that way you're getting all of this light flooding in. Because again, like most of this is out of focus. They walk into shadow after a set amount of time, and I feel like a lot of this you can do in comp, right? In terms of, I think later in the shot she starts to walk in shadow as they get away from the direct light. So it's more about just imitating the camera motion and tracking as much as possible. Here are all the passes so you can get a basic idea of like what to expect. So green screen, again, stand-ins for the talent just to represent them, so they've got someone to interact with. There you're pulling your key and then you're eroding the edge and then just grading everything to make it all fit. And then you would have occlusion mats if, like, let's say one of these guys walked in front of her, so that way they're able to stand in the foreground. So that's the general workflow. I mean, it's hard to say 100% like what the solutions were, but I'd imagine like that's pretty much it. It's like, break it down into similar situations. I know that they did some 3D scans, so I'd imagine there are certain shots that it made sense just to go digital, and that's in a way going to have its own challenges, but it's also going to make things a little bit easier too, because then you're dropping your puppet into the shot and getting it to do exactly what you need it to do. So I thought I'd talk about a few of the other just one-off shots that I wasn't going to talk about, but I figured I could just throw them in here too, so that way we've got a little bit more to talk about here. These ones I won't really spend much time on, but you got digital money, digital muzzle flashes, the lens flares being added in post, you know, that sort of thing. So there's just a lot of this stuff. I'd say everything in the background here is more sparks and just little shooters they have going off in the background there, but obviously all the blood is more digital squibs that are being added in. So like I said, I'd imagine there's just like a team of people just doing blood sims non-stop, and yeah, adding in money and just other things just to kind of dirty up the shot. And that's just what you want sometimes, is just to add in as much crap into the air, into the space, just to make things interesting. At the same time, I thought it'd be fun just to talk a bit about some of these explosions. There's a lot of these going on, and the way I imagine these being done is that you're just doing a digital explosion, just running a sim. And it's not too difficult to pull this stuff off. You got some sparks and other things kind of shooting out, as well as debris, and those are just things to help kind of break it up. But overall, once it gets to around, okay, I guess in this shot it doesn't really hang, but in some of the other ones, they tend to hang for quite a long time. I think this might be one of them. But these are all just digital sims. more of them. But I'd say a lot of the time they're comping in explosion footage as well. Like I say, it's more when they go full frame. So I don't think it's the case here. But in some of the other ones, like earlier on, I've forgotten the girl's name, but when she blows up, thanks to her friend shooting her gasoline tank, this guy. So when it happens though, when the fire is lingering for a long time, you're not going to see much detail when the camera is encapsulated inside the explosion. If this is the blast radius, then the camera's here. It's essentially fog. You've got this volumetrics encapsulating everything. It's very hard to see any rolling detail, things like that. Typically, a lot of these are built to be seen as an external thing, because they're just a solver. It's not like it's using real physics. It's just something that looks similar to what a real explosion might look like. And because of that, internally, you're not going to see all the detailed fire and everything else. So usually you'd introduce composite elements just to kind of reintroduce a lot of detail from the explosion in there. But there's just a lot of that. It's kind of the same setup every time. Like if you look at the debris here, if you look at the debris here, it's identical. Like why is it always the same shapes? What's up with that? So it kind of feels like someone just has like an explosion set up and then just dropping it into these shots. This is a bit more interesting because at least it's interacting with the environment, so you got a lot of wood being shattered, stuff like that. But I guarantee you can probably see there's little shapes in there that were just like these guys here and these guys here. So kind of the same setup just over and over and over. But, you know, it does the job, I guess. And then there's this shot here, which I figured we could talk about. And part of me wants to say this was digital, but the fact that it's really blown out white and none of the other explosions in the whole movie are, this I think is a good indicator that this is actually all real, because that's what I was saying in video 1, that you got some fire, real fire on some of the trees and it's blown out white, and then every bit of simulated fire seems to be more pastel colors instead. So the fact that this is blown out, like this is how it should look, especially a shot like this. Like you are going to get some glow, you are going to get color because it's a low exposure shot. It's at nighttime or it's at dusk right now. And a lot of these they shot on the red with a Monstro sensor. So I believe like these would have gotten into nighttime, and they're just shooting with a lot of dynamic range. So there's a lot of stops you can punch up to still get light in the shot, even though it's being shot with like no real lights at all. So it's pretty impressive. So the first time I'd seen this, I'd actually thought that this was all simulated. I was like, hey, that's pretty cool. But yeah, looking through it all, you know, it's especially having looked at all the other explosions a lot more closer and just kind of seeing a lot of the kind of reoccurring problems that do pop up with color, things like that. And again, like I realized that they're probably creative calls from either Snyder or from the client-side VFX soup. So it's not to say that like, you know, everyone doing these shots are doing it wrong. It's just the creative decisions to not blow out and not make it hot, all those things that it's fire, it's a light source, it should have that. So that's kind of where I feel like there's that bit of inconsistency. So that being said, just looking through all this, like I'd say that it's more than likely that there is some augmentation going on with adding digital fire. So I mean, I could be wrong, but I'm assuming that a lot of this stuff down here is digital fire, but I'm pretty confident a lot of this bigger explosion is all live action. And if it's not, then let me know in the comments, and congratulations. Like I think that this looks really cool, but I do feel that I do feel like this explosion here is live action. There is a second explosion here, which I do kind of wonder as well whether that might be CG, especially because it does kind of fall the same fate as the other ones we've talked about, where they're not white as much, and this just feels a bit flatter overall. So I'm just assuming that that's perhaps like an additional CG explosion added in, and CG fire and sparks down here. Could be wrong. And then obviously there's a lot of additional fire here. And then there's all this stuff, but yeah, this stuff kind of stands out a lot. And it's partially because it gets very transparent. And that's usually not what's going to happen with the fire. As it starts to cool down, it won't necessarily get transparent like this. So just a lot of stuff here. It's partially the way it's comped in, and it's just how the fire is behaving. It doesn't really hold up extensively. And I kind of wonder with the fire down here whether some of that is footage added in, not just CG fire, but footage added on top. I don't know, because it's a bit odd. So I could be wrong about that, but I feel like this might be a combination of footage and simulated fire. But honestly, like a lot of this stuff, what I would be doing is just doing straight up sims, but just really focus on getting the motion and the feel of the shader thing to really hold up a lot more. And it's interesting because you got some stuff like smaller flames down here, but they're way more blown out than this stuff up here isn't nearly as blown out, and it's got transparent patches, you know, stuff like that. And same thing here. I mean, this looks good. It just, like I said, it feels like it's a bit more transparent than it should be. Because when I say transparent with fire, what I mean by that is just having fire comped on fire where it just ends up becoming quite murky, opposed to being consistent. And if you look at like this explosion versus some of this stuff here, just very different feel to it. And then you got the 3D holding container, whatever, and you got the sparks and the smoke and everything. And I feel like that stuff's really good. Like it works. Then you got this guy here, which comes in, splat, and then comes back out. So I'm assuming this is all 3D. I think there's a prop later on that you can see it has a lot more detail. You could totally do all this just with comp gags, where you just have the walls come in, they're 3D, and then you just have this blood emission. So you got the powder, there's a decal, you got the water being liquid, I mean. So basically a 3D sim for the liquid, and then you have like these splatter maps get wiped on, like reveal underneath, and you have all the spritz and the blood mist on top. And that's all that needs to be. And then coming out here, you could totally shoot this where you just have something roughly tracked in to be, where the 3D would match it, and just have these two things pull it apart as a gag, even on a green screen, and have that reveal. But I feel like in this case, just the whole thing's 3D. So in other words, you have a lock-off plate here, this guy's standing here, and that's it. Everything else gets done in 3D. So you have this come in, splat, got all the effects sims, everything else, and then you've rigged this up where it's just essentially like a big soft body and cloth. We have all this stuff dangling, and you have like liquid pouring down everywhere. I mentioned before, like my one pet peeve is like motion blur when it comes to liquid, and I do feel like the motion blur here, it's either the motion blur or it's just very stringy. But personally, I feel like the blood kind of trickling down here looks a bit odd. I love it grouping on the ground. All that looks great. All of this looks great. It's just me being picky about the liquid dropping here, and it's just more of a personal preference. Now, I figured I'd mention this because there's a few effect shots where you got Tig putting out a fire. Everything's digital. In fact, yeah, knowing the type of work they've done with like the flapping sheet here and everything, I'd say this is entirely 3D. But you got all the smoke blowing, and it's partially because like whenever you are doing mass amounts of pollution these days, anywhere, usually you have to pay a lot of additional money to compensate for the fact that you're damaging the environment, which is why a lot of people are opting to just go digital with a lot of this stuff, because it's better for the environment than to be just pumping out loads and loads of smoke and fire everywhere. So same thing here, like all this stuff is all digital, and it's also partially because that way it's safe for the talent. They're not going to get their lungs filled up with smoke or burn themselves or anything else like that. But it's good to be aware of this, because sometimes like you might be killing vampires and doing cool stuff. Other times you might be doing these throwaway shots that aren't as interesting, but it's part of the gig, and so you got to take that into consideration. And again, you can see these heavily saturated embers in here as well. It's actually interesting because as I'm recording this, I was just reading through the comments from yesterday, and I thought it was interesting. One of the guys, shout out to Mario, commented on one of the videos saying that he actually worked on a few of the shots from video 1. And yeah, it's fun talking about this stuff because I'm giving my best educated guess as a visual effects supervisor on how we would do a lot of this stuff. But that's not to say that it is how it was actually done. But it is cool to get a shout out and confirmation that a lot of the calls with these sequences that I'm mentioning, it was actually done exactly that, including the creative calls about the oversaturation and things like that. And I figure it's worthwhile mentioning that because that's why I've gone out of my way not to be overcritical about a lot of these shots, saying, oh, what the hell, like this is wrong and that wasn't done right. Because I feel like most of the time in production, there's always a story behind those creative decisions. So just because something doesn't look right doesn't mean that it was the artist at fault. It's sometimes that you get feedback from a client, you get feedback from a supervisor who's telling you to make it pink or do whatever. On Superman Returns, the sun, like I remember on the last week of production, the visual effects supervisor for the movie was trying to tell us to make the sun in the movie pink instead of red. Now, I was working on set for that movie, and the code name for the project, because you can't say I'm working on Superman, like your identity badges for Fox Studios will always say, it was a Warner Brothers movie, but it was at the Fox lot. They were always saying Red Sun. So, I mean, the movie code name was Red Sun. And that was actually a tricky one too, because I knew that the director didn't want a pink sun. So it was one of those things that if I addressed that note, then the director's going to come back saying, what the hell is this? Change it back. And suddenly you've got to appease to all the hierarchy and address everyone, make sure that they feel heard, but align with the director's vision the entire time, which is always tricky. Another thing I'll quickly mention as well, someone else commented on video 2 mentioning that it drives them crazy that there's a slow motion close-up shot, and I feel like making a video about the subject because it's a bigger one and I won't get into a big rant, but there's a close-up muzzle flash of a pistol firing in the end sequence, and he was mentioning that slow motion shot, you're not really going to see the pistol recoil. All you're going to see is the flash, and the recoil will happen later. And so it really frustrated him, and that's one of those things that just because it's not doing what it would in reality doesn't necessarily mean that they missed that note, that they didn't think of that. Sometimes it's that you do a test and you're like, wow, with the pistol not recoiling back at all, now it looks wrong, even though it's right. And so this takes the viewer out of the movie because they're watching the movie and then they see something and it's like, huh, would it do that? That looks weird. There's something wrong with that thing. And you're not there in the room to say, well, actually, blah, 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 and explain it to them. All it's doing is disconnecting them from focusing on everything going on. The same way that I was explaining how the nuclear bomb's going off right behind them, and I would love to see that, but it will take away from the action and the whole point of like the lenses, everything they chose to make you feel where you're right in the mix of this whole helicopter scramble fight wrestling thing going on. And that's just it. There's so many times where you've got to look for doing something that the viewer is going to not think about, even though it mightn't be correct all the time. And I just interviewed Sam Wickert, from the director of Chalk Warfare, about that exact thing, where skydiving, all the skydiving people go crazy about Tom Cruise saying like, oh, he doesn't know how to skydive, it's all wrong, because he's skydiving horizontally down, but it works better in frame. That way you're able to not only have more airtime, but it'll fill out the frame. But if he's vertical, which is what you would be doing with skydiving, so you go faster, then you're going to have less filming time, and on top of that, it's not going to work for the shot. So unfortunately, you don't always imitate reality. You got to go for what actually works. And it's just something to think about when you think, well, that's wrong, or that artist did a bad job. It's like, no, it's not always the case. It's usually that they followed the direction they were given, and they're a talented artist. It's just they were given very specific instructions that might be counterintuitive to how you and I feel. So there's this shot here, which I think is utterly gross. It's just neck snap. And I haven't really given this much thought. There's a few different ways you could do it. Mostly it's going to be a comp, so it's going to be her with a green bodysuit, and then you're just doing a 3D neck to match it all up, or just trying to do it in comp. But that's typically where you can have her neck around and whip around to do it. Otherwise, you could do it 3D and then kind of settle for landing on her performance right there. So there's a few different ways to do it, but either way, it's going to involve her body being separate from the head being filmed. And then all of this 3D stuff here is all, well, 3D. And then you got this is the gross bit, is her, what is it, a collarbone or something pops out. Sorry, my anatomy isn't on par, but yeah, it's really gross. And then there's this, I figured I'd mention this, but you got all these muzzle flashes. So again, CG muzzle flashes, lens flares, the whole deal. And usually what's happening is that you're given the plate, which is going to have all the interactive lighting in there. You might still bump it up and do some stuff in comp, but usually you're just matching the timing of the lighting. So that way the muzzle flashes happen same time as that's happening. And then with these are just comp elements of sparks. I'd say they're probably 3D, yeah. Because a lot of the time real sparks don't just fizzle out. It's usually 3D that tends to just go for that. I've got into some big discussions, I'll say, with some directors about like their style of sparks versus mine, where they insist on sparks lingering forever opposed to cooling down. And lastly, I figured I'd mention dropping the 3D head, which I just thought was really cool. So there's a few ways you could do this. I assume you would just do the entire thing digital. So 3D simulated head with hair, the whole deal, and then splat there. I'd say that's just how it is. But what is interesting is so I'd say that's just how that's done, but I do like the way the camera's done because it follows through ahead of time, and that's typically what you would be doing with a real camera. You're not going to keep it in frame the entire time. It's not going to be as perfect follow through. You're usually going to whip down, and usually it might fall out of frame and then catch up. But that's usually where there's a gag. And that's why I just mentioned that, like, I'm pretty sure this is entirely CG, but you could actually drop the head, and then as it leaves frame, you cut to the 3D sim. Or you could just straight up film this and have it just splat on the ground. Either way, it's gross. I love it. And finally, I just figured I'd end on this. Again, muzzle flashes, CG money fluttering around, sparks and blood. And then you got what looks like a robot head. So I know the internet's kind of going crazy about that. Like, what the hell? Why is there a Terminator in there? So I'm kind of curious to see what the backstory is on that. I know they're doing prequels and a bunch of other stuff. Because I know there's like a few shots with like blue eyes. I think there's one right here, this guy. But my understanding is that they have like this blue stuff in their brain, or it infects them and makes it blue, but that kind of drives them. But this clearly is a robot, so it'd be interesting to find out what the deal is with that. But I'm going to end it there. Hopefully you guys got a lot from this. This is a lot of fun to do. I'm still kind of messing with the format of these, but again, like, originally when I approached this, I thought I'd just do it for fun and kind of just talk about more how I'd approach a lot of this stuff. But the more feedback I've gotten from you guys, the more clear it is that, like, I take it for granted that all of us are at a different path in doing this stuff. We might know 3D, but we don't understand filmmaking yet, or the whole pipeline and process. So I'm happy to kind of really go in depth and explain and over-explain if you guys are interested in that. As you can tell, I'm already referring to comments, so as I'm recording these, I'm always interested in hearing your feedback, and it gives me a chance to actually answer a lot of that stuff too. So feel free to comment, and I'm always happy to both respond in the comments. You probably noticed I've responded to everything, but at the same time, it's a chance for me to talk about it here as well and really kind of go in depth. And yeah, I mean, again, I'm just doing this for a little while. I want to see how this goes. I'll probably do Mortal Kombat next, and then after that, I'm going to just decide, like, is this something that you guys want? If it isn't, then the little bit of spare time I have, I'll probably put it elsewhere. But if this is something you guys are enjoying and find this very valuable, then let me know, because that's the main thing, is that if this is something that you find valuable, in other words, if there's a lot of people watching this stuff and it is being well received, I'll definitely continue this and try to make these a weekly thing, which means I'm putting out 6 videos a week just on this topic. But yeah, it just comes down to whether it's received well, because I definitely don't have much time in the day. In fact, I've got 17 minutes before my next meeting. So I'm going to wrap it up here. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you got a lot from it. Definitely let me know if you want to see more of these, and also any ideas on how to improve these, whether it is stop talking on tangents or talk more on tangents, whatever it might be. I value your input, and I'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't seen the previous 4 videos yet, make sure to check them out in the links in the description below. I've put them all together in a playlist for you. And this was an absolute pleasure to create this video series for you, and each week I plan to release a new series diving deep into the production process of these visual effects films. If there's a particular film that you want to see a VFX breakdown for, let me know in the comments. So in the next series, I'm going to be covering Mortal Kombat. I'm going to be covering all the visual effects sequences in the film, as well as a lot of the creative process for creating those visual effects. Creating these videos weekly is a lot of work, but I love sharing and I love helping other creators like yourself. All I ask is if you want to support this channel, as well as ensure that I can create more of these videos, please like and subscribe to my channel, as well as feel free to spread the word so that others can benefit from these videos as well. Like I said, it might not mean much to you, but it'll mean the world to me. And you won't miss out on any of the upcoming content that I put out daily. This has been an absolute pleasure. All of this content I make for free, so that way you can get a better understanding of the visual effects process and filmmaking as well. One last thing, I just recently put out a free course on how to raise your prices, as well as how to land your dream clients as an artist. I've been in the industry for over 25 years, both as an artist as well as a manager, hiring artists as well as managing them, and of course paying them as well. So I'm very familiar with this topic. For me, it's a pet peeve when people say that there's no money in art, there's no career as an artist, or art doesn't pay. I want to eliminate the starving artist mindset for good. That's why I've created this 8-hour free course on everything I know about pricing yourself as an artist, how to raise your prices, how to land your dream clients that are willing to pay you what you're worth. And at least for now, this course is completely free to download. So get the entire 8-hour free course at pricingclass.com, or click the link below in the description, so that way you can check it out there as well. And if you like this video, I've put another video somewhere up above me that I think you're also going to like as well. I've also put a link to the playlist for all the visual effects breakdowns that you can check out that I've created as well. I'm Allan McKay. Thanks for watching.